But it's my great pleasure to introduce Grace Park. Grace and I have known each other. I was just thinking about this the other day. We have known each other about 30 years. We were in seminary together. Our orbits crossed over quite a bit with lots of mutual friends and a few parties that we attended at the same time. I believe we were in one evening known as the Fuller Follies a long, long time ago, and I'll let Grace decide whether or not she wants to tell you details about that. But Grace has been doing some research over the last few years on using interfaith relationships as a way to combat loneliness and isolation in ministry. And so it's with that I want to introduce Grace Park. She's not on my screen yet, but if you put yourself on speaker view, you will see her. And we welcome Grace Park to present on her dissertation. Grace, I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you, John. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share with you what I've learned over the last few years. And as you can see here, the first slide shows the actual entire title of my dissertation, Making Room at the Table, Clergy Isolation and Community Building Through Interfaith Dialogue. Now, as you may or may not know, the Doctor of Ministry is what we consider to be, and we want to be, a practical degree. So it's we are writing down and then taking out into the world after we've done research. So this degree is supposed to be in praxis or in practice. And so we are encouraged by our professors from the very beginning in thinking about and formulating what we are going to talk about. We are encouraged by our professors and faculty to make it very personal, to make what we talk about, what we think about, what we're going to live and breathe and research on for the next few years to be not only deeply personal, but something that we are passionate about and something that is also applicable to leadership and to ministry today, something that could be shared with other people who are in leadership. And so, and Dr. Blair, who is here today, she basically outlines the work that we're going to do. And she tells us, make sure that what you are doing, you need to remember that this is ministry. You are engaged in ministry while you are studying. So you are doing ministry for other leaders, for other ministers. So this particular dissertation, my dissertation, came from a real personal place for me. It was a time of trial in my ministry. And I began to think about how could I learn from what I encountered? How could I learn from it? And then how can other people learn from what I learned? And so you see her here on this next slide. This was the genesis of my thinking, my praying about, and my going forward in the studies. And it was this concept of isolation. And so I myself endured a great season of isolation and loneliness in my own ministry as a pastor. And it was the catharsis of my research. And as you can see here, we have the image of somebody who is sitting alone and yet in a crowd of people. And I'm sure that all of us have encountered this feeling at one point or another in our lives, whether it is in our personal lives or our professional lives. We have this sense that we are alone, even we are in the midst of people. And then we have added on top of that, this notion that somehow we need to be a strong individual. We need to be a rock. We need to be able to subsist on our own. And we're weak if we are not able to do that. And so this was the genesis of where my thinking began, because I myself was walking through a very, very difficult season in my ministry. But it's also evident that, and we all know this, that even before COVID, our nation, our communities, our world, we were all grappling with issues of loneliness already. This was a commonplace problem that we had. And now in COVID, in this last year of 2020, which has been so incredibly unique, there are greater issues of isolation. And I'm sure those of you who belong to church communities now, and even you might be here today as one of those people who are struggling with a great sense of isolation because we've had to shelter in place, because we are asked to stay at home to be safer. Those of us who live alone may be struggling with a greater sense of isolation even before. And we know that we have an epidemic of isolation that is going on with the two ends of the spectrum of ages. We have older adults who are really struggling with feeling isolated and alone. We also have a surprising number of young adults, college kids, high school kids who are also struggling with the same sense of isolation. Sam, if I could have the next slide. No, next slide. There we go. Okay, as if by magic. So these are a couple books that I just want to share with you. They were part of the literature and part of the basis in which I began to understand this concept of aloneness. And on the left, you'll see a book by Robert Putnam, who is a political scientist at Harvard. He composed and talked about this concept called social capital. And his whole thesis was that after World War II, we began to lose in the United States what he calls social capital, meaning that people were not investing in this concept of community, but they were engaging more and more in aloneness. And then on the right, you see a more contemporary concept, alone together. This is another, I believe, professor back east, and she talks about how technology has created even greater gaps. And ironically, technology has brought us together in some amazing ways, and yet, ironically, it has brought us further apart. And so we see this general sense of a loss of community. And then I took it to a deeper level, a little bit more of I shrunk it down a little bit more to leadership and loneliness in leadership. So you can see here, this was the basis of my challenge statement in writing my dissertation. And this came about with a lot of, might I say, weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Dr. Blair, this is probably my 20th iteration of what my challenge statement was to be. But that in and of itself, in writing the dissertation, was a wonderful exercise in trying to bring a cohesiveness to what I was thinking, all ideas I had. So there are some basic outlines here that I was able to distill everything into. First, leadership in ministry can be an isolating endeavor. And so my hope and hypothesis was that bridge building across faith lines could be a useful instrument in talking about loneliness in leadership. Secondly, my project hoped to reflect on the deep and real issues of isolation in leadership, in ministry, and then move to urging our community of leaders, clergy, ministers, pastors, urging the community to understand that self-care, part of self-care is for clergy not to operate alone, but to operate in community in some way. And then taking it to the next step, hoping and exploring the notion of possibly an interfaith leaders group for dialogue and community, not just staying within our own enclaves, not just staying within our own denomination, not just staying within our own faith, but being able to bring people together on an interfaith basis to really combat this issue of loneliness. So how do we create community this way? So if we could look at the next slide, we can kind of see how everything came together. And so then my question was, how do we make more room at the table? So we talk about the pressures of leadership. We talk about the isolation that it creates. And so how do we make more room at the table for different clergy who want to come together, who are seeking community, who are seeking help, who are seeking an answer to isolation? How do we create a community that can nourish one another? How can we create a community that encourages one another and that's really life-giving and it's not life-taking? We as pastors and as leaders, we are always in a place where we are trying to give to others. So how can we come to a table that is going to give to us? So in our dissertation, our professors encourage us to think on 3 research questions and to base all of our research and our thinking around 3 key questions. The first question arises from a psychosocial point of view. The second question arises from a theological point of view. And the third question of research is based on a historical point of view. So I asked myself these questions as I looked at clergy loneliness. Why do pastors feel so isolated? Why are we struggling with a sense of loneliness and aloneness? Well, you talk to any pastor and they'll tell you that there is a unique pressure that pastors feel. We live in a fishbowl. There are realistic and unrealistic expectations that are placed on us by other people and by ourselves. We have unique issues of leading in a church where leadership in for instance, a for-profit organization would be very different. There are ministry frustrations that we encounter. There's no one with which we can share honestly. We're plagued with feelings of exhaustion. We struggle with the fact that, do we really have any friends that we can share honestly with what we are struggling? So I approached that question asking, why do pastors feel isolated, and kind of delve into that. Secondly, theologically, we asked the question, well, who exactly is in our community? If we're talking about building community, what is our community? What does it mean for us to create koinonia? And historically, koinonia is a term that we use for a Christian fellowship. But what does it mean to expand the table, to broaden our definition of koinonia, to have this understanding that our beloved kinship could be greater and found in unexpected ways? And then asking the theological question, who is our neighbor? And I believe that Jesus answers this question to us when he is asked the question, who is my neighbor, by an attorney and a lawyer. And Jesus says, he gives the story of the Good Samaritan. And he presents the answer in an unexpected way. Who is our neighbor? Everyone. There are no fences, there are no bounds, there are no understanding of who is my neighbor. Everyone is my neighbor. And so then we move to the historical question, if everyone indeed can be our neighbor or should be our neighbor, and if we can enter into a place of community with unexpected different ways, and we look at the interfaith community, well, what work has been done there? Are we starting from scratch? What are we doing? Are we starting at square one? Well, we're not, because historically, worldwide, there have been great strides and attempts in not only ecumenical work together, but interfaith work and interfaith dialogue and interfaith conversation, interfaith understanding. And we look at the sociologist, Dr. Ibu Patel. He's done work between Muslims and Catholics. We look at Dr. Dale Irvin of our own New York Theological Seminary, who says that the basic missiology of the church is that we are supposed to be building bridges. We are supposed to be opening doors. We are creating bridges, not creating doors that are closed. We look at our own PCUSA and we see that there have been so many attempts to create an interfaith conversation, making the table bigger. So how did I do this personally in my own research? How did I do this for my own studying? So my methodology, we're asked by our professors to talk about a methodology. How are you going to do this? Which way are you going to go to gather your data? And so my data gathering was done through interviews. And I asked many different clergy from many different faiths. I interviewed a couple Muslim clerics, monks, Catholic priests, Episcopals, Lutherans, Latter-day Saints. I had one-on-one interviews with them, and I sat down with them, and they allowed me to listen to their life. They allowed me to listen to the struggles of loneliness that they went through. They allowed me to listen to parts of their hearts that had been broken in ministry. They allowed me to listen to stories of hope for the future. And they helped me to understand my own loneliness and my own desires for community better from hearing their voices. This picture that you'll see here is one of the wonderful events that I was able to be a part of and to produce and execute and bring together as a result of some of my research. And so what I did was I helped facilitate an interfaith clergy group in the town where I minister. And in my little town, we have in about a square mile radius of 5 miles, we had a Church of Latter-day Saint, a Catholic church, a Lutheran church, a Presbyterian church, Self-Realization Fellowship, and a Methodist church. And so what I did was I created monthly fellowship meetings in which we all came together and we just shared. And at every meeting, I would pose a question. Why is church attendance going down? What do you do if somebody comes to you and tells you something that is supposed to be confidential, but is shockingly dangerous? How do you deal with a problem person in your parish? We discussed these month by month. And through these monthly meetings, we ended up being able to put together this amazing afternoon. We had over 100 people from our neighborhoods come to this afternoon, and we discussed racism. And we had clergy sitting at every single table. We had a panel of clergy asking questions, and this was part of what I was able to bring together in my 3 years of studying. It was an amazing afternoon. We continue to meet as interfaith clergy. We continue to put together these neighborhood, these group events as well. But that was part of my methodology and part of how I chose to do my research. The next slide will show you some of us who participated in our monthly meetings. And you will see here on the picture on the left, in that picture, we have a group of us, different faiths, very, very different faiths. And yet we came to the table and we were able to say, this is what we have in common. Yes, we are so different theologically. Yes, we are never going to agree on certain things. Yes, we might not agree on the person of Jesus Christ, but we are together in this. We are working together and we are together in this and we're here for one another. So we meet, we continue to meet, and now we meet over Zoom once a month. And I still am the one who puts those together. On the right, you'll see an example of another event that I was able to be a part of. We had a Buddhist monk, we had a cleric, an imam, and a rabbi, and myself. And we talked about what it means to come together as different people of faith, to combat and to bring together social justice in our world. And boy, let me just tell you, if you were at this event, we were so theologically so very different, and yet there was a tapestry that ran through us that talked about the reality of what we're all trying to do together. And so this is a little part and parcel of my my dissertation. But so the question that our professors leave us with is, what change would you like to elicit in the world from what you've learned, from what you've taken in, from what you've ingested, from what you've processed? How are you going to go forward? How are you going to teach other ministers? How will you help in this field of leadership? And so my hope and my desire is that through conversations like this, through different conversations that I have with other clergy, I am calling for clarification and renewal for the understanding that part of self-care for clergy is this understanding of community. That it is not a luxury that we should think that we may or may not be afforded, but it is rather a necessity for us to go forward with, to have healthy ministries, to be able to have a healthy work-life balance, to be able to have hope for the future for us as clergy. We need a renewed calling for self-care. And for all of us to remember as leaders and as future leaders that we as leaders and as clergy, we're called to help transform lives. But in order for us to transform, be in the helping process of transforming others' lives, our own lives must continually be transformed as well. So that's a little glimpse of what I learned. I was This was possibly the best 3 years of learning I have done. So this is my so undergrad, graduate, beginning of another master's degree, and this one clearly by far is my most favorite degree, the one that I value the most, and I am so thankful for. So thanks for listening and sharing a little bit of what I learned the last few years.
Thank you, Grace. I really enjoyed that. I have been looking forward to this, and I don't think I realized how much I needed to hear what you shared with us. I love the idea that faith leaders have commonalities that go alongside or deeper or transcend. I'm not sure what the right verb is there, but that come alongside our doctrinal or practical differences. That faith leaders have commonalities that give them an opening for community that is unique and that is different than the community we find with friends and even family. And so that's a great thing. I've got a couple of questions for you, just to drill in a little bit on a couple of things. As a working pastor myself, this resonates with me, and I'm wondering if you have explored or talked about ways that you can share this with other church leaders to share what you have learned in your own research in a practical way with other church leaders.
Well, church leaders need to invite me to come and talk to them about this. I'm happy to talk to anybody about this, but I really am asking others as I come in contact with them to really think about this idea of community. And when I meet other church leaders and I work with them, I also ask if they are in a covenant group, an encouraging community that doesn't leave them out there on their own, that it gives them a place where they can really honestly share what's going on in their lives. But I am constantly asking now other leaders to really make that a mindful part of their ministry practice, that to understand that this is an absolute need that they have to have in their lives. So I would appreciate anybody here today also spreading the word and letting people know that community is so very important for all of us in many different ways, but it also has the ability to relieve pressure and to encourage in surprising ways that we might not have ever thought.
I think as I have taken on a new church role during the COVID crisis, it means that I've moved to a new area, but don't get a chance to meet the people in my congregation. And so this sense of isolation is real. Absolutely. And I think that I have another dear friend who's been prodding me along in interfaith relationships for many years now, and I might have to listen to her. She is on this call too, and she'll be smiling the biggest as she hears me say that. But you touched a little bit on this, but your research started before the COVID crisis. And I'm wondering if the last few months have informed some of your questions and also some of your conclusions in your research about loneliness among church leaders.
Yes, I think it certainly has. I think we would really be a very clueless person if in the last few months our lives haven't changed in ginormous ways. And I think for those of us who are in leadership in church, we realize that the needs of the folks in our church are very different now. And going forward, the landscape of church is going to look very different. We don't know at what point we're going to be able to gather in a way that we used to. So how does the church then go forward and be able to facilitate fellowship? This is fellowship in a way, but it's also strained. It's also different. So how we need to be thinking creatively on how we can do that. And we can really do that if we stay connected with one another as leaders. And I think it's really important. And I don't know about you, but when we were really in the thick of it in the beginning, after the shock wore off, and then we kind of slid into this, oh, this is the way that life is going to be for a while. I think people started kind of going, okay, I'm just going to hunker down and and our circles became a lot smaller, right? Mm-hmm. You began to realize who was really the the ride or die people in your life. And those were the people that you were really saying, okay, this is just as much as I can muster, so I'm going to do this. But then after a while, we began to realize it's got to be a little bit more than this. It's got to be, where is it? And so we are experiencing all of this in our own personal lives. I think personally, individually, and corporately, we have to figure out how are we going to go forward and bring about a sense of true fellowship and relationship. I'm sorry, John, I think I digressed a bit.
No, that's very helpful, Grace. Thank you. Before I ask my last question, I'm going to invite those of you who have questions and know how to use the chat function in Zoom, feel free to type those in. You can send those directly to me, and I'll relay those to Grace. That keeps us in the sound-friendly means of using Zoom without everybody speaking over each other. So if you've got a question, feel free to send it to me. But I'll just say, and because this has been a part of my own background in relation to interfaith activities, is that there is a misperception, I think, that that a person loses their own theological distinctives as they enter into interfaith partnerships or ministries or conferences or even just gatherings, that somehow you have to check what makes you distinctive as a Christian before you go in the door. And I just want to hear you talk just a little bit to that concern.
Oh, I appreciate that you say that, because actually in the very beginning, this is something that Dr. Blair and I actually discussed quite a bit, because I ran my challenge statement and my thesis, my ideas by a few friends, and they said, you can't do this. You're a Christian Presbyterian pastor. You will not succeed, because at some point you're going to be knocked at your knees, because you're going to come to the table and you're going to realize that you don't have enough in common and you're going to lose who you are. And I found the exact opposite to have occurred. When I went into these places where the faith tradition was vastly different than mine, it actually solidified what I believed. And it made me have a greater understanding of my own faith. But that is a very real concern. I actually deal with it in a small portion in my dissertation about the problem of pluralism, that we would be called pluralists, or in some way we would be watering down our own faith or diluting what we believe in. I found it to be actually the exact opposite. Yeah.
That's really helpful, Grace. Thank you. I hope that's a message that can get out. As one person, I think it's Dr. Blair, has encouraged you to put this into a book.
Encouraging me that well. I appreciate the voice.
I think there is. I really do, Grace, think that there is room for a distillation of your research in book form that pastors would read, especially now. I think after these last 6 or 8 or 9 months, I've lost track of isolation being not just a byproduct of what we do, but actually built into the job.
It is indeed. It truly is.
Any other questions that other people would like to ask? I'm not seeing anything come through on the chat function, but Grace, what's next for you as you do this? I asked this already, and I sort of tipped my hand on encouraging you to write a book. But now I work in a church near the ocean too, so that's not really a draw for you since you're already in Pacific Palisades. But I think there's room for an interfaith group that I know up here to welcome you as a speaker, one way or another, either in person or on Zoom. And so prepare for a little bit of that.
I would be honored. I would be honored. And John, our interfaith group continues to meet, and it's actually been such a blessing because we all get to see what we're all doing at our churches. And so we say, hey, did you have an outdoor worship service? Did you try this? What are you doing? What does your diocese say? So it's been a continued wonderful community because we can safely share what's going on in our churches and not feel like we're violating any confidences, and yet still get a lot of wisdom from other people. So I really encourage other pastors who are kind of scared to do it, to really try and just reach out and say, hey, would you mind just meeting with me? And so for me, it started out with lunches. I just kept asking every individual person out to lunch, and who's going to turn down a free lunch, right? Certainly not this
Not
girl.
me.
So that's right. So I just started out by saying, can I take you out to lunch?
Mm.
Can I start a relationship with you? Can you mentor me? Can you give me your wisdom? And people were glad to do it. And I was glad to receive it. And then it developed into a more robust, larger group, for
Yeah,
which I am so thankful.
that's fantastic. One question from the floor. This is from a longtime pastor in our audience today. Um, he's always met during the course of his ministry with groups of leaders within his own church, within his own congregation. How does interfaith dialogue offer something more even than what we might experience in our groups of sameness?
Well, I'm assuming this comes from Pastor Tom, who is one of
Yes.
my mentors. He's just an amazing man of God. So it's just so funny that he's asking me a question. Wow. So, I really believe that we have the opportunity, and we should not have the hubris to think that we've got all the answers,
Mm,
right? That's such a great amount of hubris for us to think that we've got it all figured out in terms of our faith journey.
mm,
And so I always approach every single time that I come together in our interfaith group thinking and hoping that I will learn something new about God through the eyes of somebody else.
mm, mm,
And I have seen that happen time and time again over these past few years, that when somebody else tells me about their journey with God and the way that God appeared to them in a way that I had never heard before, I've been in awe to
mm,
see how God works in this world, and how God's spirit and how God's name and how God is evidenced, and his God's essence appears in so many different ways. And so I always feel a great sense of awe when I come into an interfaith dialogue, because I know that a new part of God is going to be revealed to me in a way that I've never known before.
mm. That leads us into what I think is our last question, and that is from Wayne. What is or what was the greatest surprise that your research revealed?
Um, Actually, so Wayne is one of my cohort buddies, and um, I'm going to twist that question just a little bit. I'm going to ask the question, Wayne, what was the biggest surprise that this D.Min program provided? And it was the gift of you and Terry. So Wayne is a Black Baptist pastor. Terry is an okay, we can call him this because he just is. He's an old dude. We called him the old dude. He was like, he's older. And then there was me. So look at the diversity in just our cohort. It was amazing. It was a gift. We started out with two other people who couldn't finish the program. So it ended up being the three of us. And the greatest surprise and affirmation was our group. We inspired each other. We kept each other accountable. We freaked out on each other. We learned from each other. We taught each other. And that was the greatest gift and the greatest surprise that this program gave me. And I felt it was great because it was part and parcel of what I was doing my research on. Opening up tables, expanding tables, adding leaves into our tables, and bringing more chairs to the table. Wayne even joined us for one of our interfaith dialogues in the Palisades. He drove all the way from where he came and joined us. And that's what it was all about. It was about pulling up another chair to the table and welcoming more people.